So this week we have Professor van Veelen from Creed, and he's going to tell us a little bit about the evolution of morality. So please go ahead.
Yeah, hello everyone. So it's going to be like this. So I'm first going to share a few things about the existing state of the literature, and then I'm going to tell you what's wrong with all of that. So the first half will be me wasting your time getting informed about stuff that later I will tell you is not doing a great job at explaining morality or the evolution of morality. So first of all, we are special species. There's a few dimensions in which we are special. We use language, we do maths, and we are also preoccupied with good and evil. So all the stories that we tell each other are about value judgments, and it's kind of remarkable that even in our free time we go watch series or movies or read books or tell stories that are basically playing on our instincts that judge things as good and bad. And that, yeah, so the question is, where does that come from? Yeah, and the idea is that our morality has something to do with helping us to cooperate on a small and a large scale. And what I'll try to say today is that that is true, but in a way that's different from the way we currently think about it. So first of all, humans aren't unique in our cooperation. There's cooperation everywhere in nature. And if I had even more time, there's fantastic examples in nature. This is just one of them. This is a coral. These are all individually reproducing individuals. But if there's a damage, if damage happens, then they transport energy to the damaged area where it can grow back. So they do have like a collective insurance going on here. And that's a remarkable form of cooperation, and it's everywhere in nature. Now, humans are also cooperating on a large scale. There's almost everything that we do, everything that we achieve would be completely impossible if we would have to do it on our own, right? So good things and bad things, warfare is very efficient together. Nobody on their own could invent the nuclear bombs, but also beautiful things. If Bach would have to first grow his own vegetables, build his own violin, and then start writing music, then nothing ever would have happened. It's only thanks to labor division that good and bad things happen for humans. So the question is, how does that relate? And the literature on the evolution of cooperation in general, and also cooperation for humans, is mostly about prisoners' dilemmas and public goods games. Janus told me a little bit about the background of you guys, but do let me know if I have to speed up, if things are boring, or slow down if you need some extra information, because it's hard for me to judge if I'm going too slow or too fast. So I'm assuming that everybody knows what a prisoner's dilemma is. It's a game where you can choose between two options to cooperate and defect. And the idea is that defection is always getting you a higher fitness than cooperation, regardless of what the other one's doing. That's true for the one player. It's also true for the other player. And that leaves us with one Nash equilibrium where both of us defect. And just because the Nash equilibrium is coming back later again, so the definition of a Nash equilibrium is that it's a combination of behaviors where neither of the two has a reason to deviate. So here, why is it not? Yeah. So the blue player Oh, why is my computer not responding? Ooh, the blue player doesn't have a reason to deviate, nor does the red player. And the idea why this game is used is the idea is it's the most distilled game or model where there is a difference between collective interests and individual interests. If everybody follows their individual interests, we end up both defecting, but it's clearly better for both if both of us would have cooperated. And that's why this game is so super popular, because it seems like this is the most distilled way to characterize that difference between individual and collective interests. Now, in the literature, there's an enormously large literature on the evolution of cooperation, and there are three broad categories of explanations. There's population structure, there's repetition, and there is partner choice. And I'm going to run through. I'm not going to do justice to this literature, but I'm going to try as best as I can. So population structure, one example of a population structure would be a group structure, which is kind of relevant for humans. And then the idea is that this is a group structure where groups are just floating around, but you could also, you could also have a group structure where there is also a structure of groups amongst the groups. The idea here could be that you have your fitness interests aligned within the group. So there could be competition between individuals, but there can also be competition between different groups. And that these opposing forces of selection could select for group beneficial behavior. Now, this is not, this is a polarized debate. There's a bunch of people that believe that group selection is what has driven human evolution. And there's other people that say that you don't need any group selection to explain anything about humans. Now, something that's also relevant to say is that kin selection, I'm assuming people may have heard about that. So any instance of population structure, you can also think about the process that's going on there as a process of kin selection. And the easy way to think about that is to think about a quote by Haldane, who says, "We'll jump into a river to save 2 brothers, but not 1, or 8 cousins, but not 7. And the idea that he is conveying here is that for a gene, there may be different ways to get more copies of yourself in the next generation. One is to do something that's good for the person that is carrying you, but another option is to do something that favors other individuals that have an increased likelihood of carrying the same gene. And that is why these measures of relatedness, 1/2 and 1/8, play a role here. And this is from the 60s. It's formalized by Bill Hamilton. So the idea here is that behavior that gives a benefit B to someone else at a cost C to you will evolve if these benefits are received by individuals that have a relatedness R to the one that displays the behavior. And if R times B is larger than C, then that is good for the expected number of offspring in the next, of copies of that gene in the next generation. Now, luckily, there is some development also in our area. Okay, I don't know if people read The Selfish Gene, so this book is entirely based on Hamilton's rule. Now, in the 90s, people figured out that things are actually a bit more complicated, because up to the 90s, biologists were thinking that as soon as there is relatedness, cooperation will evolve, or altruism will evolve. And that turned out already in simulations not to work. And the people that did those simulations realized that it's more complicated than that. What needs to happen is that you should not only look at those that have opportunities for cooperation, but you should also look at what the interaction, the competition structure looks like. So what you need for population structure to get cooperation evolve in prisoners' dilemmas is that you need a discrepancy between the relatedness between those that interact on the one hand, and on the other hand, there is the relatedness in the structure of those that compete with each other. So it's only if you have a discrepancy between those two does the cancellation effect not occur or can be reduced. So that's a new insight from the 90s, and it still hasn't percolated all through biology, but it is really, that's really the key. So there's like 1 million papers on population structure. There's lattices. There is stylized models with circles. There are scale-free networks, but for all of them, it always comes down to cooperation, opportunities for cooperation, in this case being more local than the competition, because your neighbors are related to you. So the further away your neighbors, the further away your competition is, and the closer by your opportunities for cooperation are, that gets you the discrepancy that's needed for cooperation to evolve in population structures. So the second category is repetition. So economists call that the shadow of the future. So if we interact not just once, but multiple times, then if you make your future cooperation conditional on what happens today, then you can basically mutually force each other into cooperation. And therefore, repetitions, of course, have to happen, have to be sufficiently likely. But if they are, then you can sustain cooperation without population structure in equilibrium. So these are just pictures to show that in any Tarantino movie, there is an instance of the shadow of the future where they are trying to force each other into mutual cooperation. So yeah, is there a question?
No, it's laughter. Yeah, laughter.
Oh, okay. Also appreciated. So there's also a large literature on repetition, and here me and some colleagues have also contributed. So this is we've made a completely general model where all strategies for the repeated game are allowed. I'm assuming that most people have heard of tit for tat as a strategy for a repeated game. But if you allow for all strategies that you can possibly play for the repeated game, then it turns out that the dynamics are not super stable. So it turns out that all kinds of equilibria can and will be played over the course of time. Yeah, my computer is really slow. So something else that we did is that we combined repetition with population structure. So it's all going to be summarized in a graph. So to see it, it might help to understand what's going on here. So on the horizontal axis, there is the repeat probability. So if it's 0, that means that we're just looking at a one-shot game that's not repeated at all. And if it's 1, that means that we're looking at an infinitely repeated game. And on the vertical axis, there is the relatedness, or really it should be seen as the discrepancy between the scale of cooperation and the scale of competition. And if it's 0, that means we're looking at a well-mixed population or some equivalent of that. And if it's 1, that means we're looking at interaction between clones. that aren't necessarily each other's, or that are not also competing equally intensely with each other. And we formulated what we call a unified theory for that. And the famous results for the ingredients are special cases here. So Hamilton's rule that you've just seen is something that you now see as a threshold on the vertical axis. And the Folk theorem, which is the most famous result about repetition from economics, is a threshold on the horizontal axis. So why do I bring this up? Because it's beautiful theory. I love it. Actually, in my room here, you can't see it, but I have pictures on the wall of this thing. The idea is, of course, that this theory has something to do with the behavior that we observe in nature. And the dream would, of course, be if you can pick different points in this square and say, you know, humans are here, elephants are here, chimpanzees are here, and you would go with those predictions to the field and see the theory confirmed. Now, unfortunately, as what?
Just a cough.
Oh, okay, sorry. I'm so eager for questions that I jump at everything. Unfortunately, this doesn't work at all. So this, as elegant as the theory is, there's no empirical prediction. There's no cross-species predictive power in this at all.
Sorry, can I ask you something?
Yes, of course.
So what is the observed behavior that you want to explain?
Yeah, so the observed behavior would be the amount of cooperation.
Yeah, but where should it be? I mean, all I mean is that what's the data?
Well, that's a good question. So in this case, the data would be more qualitative. There would be some cooperative behaviors that you do see in one species and don't see in another species. And then the hope would be, at least qualitatively, to be able to say, in humans, we are, let's say, for instance, here, we have high repetition rates and some degree of population structure. And look, we are super cooperative. And then chimpanzees are here. They're also okay cooperative, but less than humans. And then we would attribute that difference. There's a bunch of cooperative behaviors that they don't do and we do. And then that difference we could attribute to a lower repetition rate or something. So it wouldn't be more comparative statics rather than real predictions. I mean, everything is difficult to measure here, but both the behavior itself, but even such a mild hope from a model of being able to say humans have higher this than other species and therefore they're more cooperative, even that doesn't really work here. Yeah. So this is also to say that the stuff that I'm going against in this talk includes my own stuff.
Yeah, I just don't understand exactly what the claim of not explaining what you want to explain. I mean, so is the issue that you cannot get the data to know exactly where?
No. No, that's not the thing. Well, so for instance, between different species within the same part of the tree of life, for instance, there's a bunch of ant species, for instance, and you could go over these different ant species and see that some do cooperative breeding and some don't. And then you could hope to put them on different places on this axis with a relatedness of this, a relatedness of this, and then at least you could see that for some species, a cooperative behavior has not evolved, and for other species it has evolved, and then yeah, and that's it. I mean, of course, the costs and benefits are super hard to measure in nature, right? So the costs and benefits determine what this picture looks like. This intersection is going to shift up and down depending on the costs and benefits. So, of course, there was never an ambition to get with qualitative predictions to the field and see if some WASP is right below or above this line here, or exactly where it is. It would already be helpful if you could say, this species has a higher repetition rate and a lower relatedness, and we do see that that one species does have this cooperative behavior and the other doesn't. And even if we can't measure the things that would be needed for a qualitative prediction, you could say, would be in line with one being to the right of this white line and the other being to the left of this white line. Right?
Sure. Okay,
so now there's a last category that would be partner choice and signaling, also super interesting. The peacock's tail is the prime example from biology. So it could be that altruism is a byproduct of the fact that signaling, wasteful signaling, costly signaling can be beneficial for those that signal and that receive the signal. And in such a signaling equilibrium, as long as it's costly, it's fine. That's fine. And then coincidentally, it could be altruism towards others that you waste your signal on. So now let's first go to prisoners' dilemmas themselves. So what I'm going to argue is that our focus on prisoners' dilemmas and not on other games, that is something that made us miss the point, made us produce models that don't really work. But even if you want to explain, and here I should say I'm focused on humans now. I'm not focused on, there's a bunch of other things, instances of cooperation in nature where it does work. But if we are aiming at explaining human cooperative behavior, the key is really in different games. But even if you look at human behavior in prisoners' dilemmas, the match between the theory and the empirics is not great. So population structure models can have transmission that is genetic. They can have transmission that is cultural. And there's also a bunch of models where that are open to both interpretations. Now, all papers in this evolution of cooperation field, when it comes to humans, they always say the question is open because we are also nice to genetically unrelated others. So if you have a population structure model where Hamilton's rule summarizes the prediction, then you need, and transmission is genetic, then you need, then the prediction is that you're nice to those you are genetically related to and not nice to those that you're not genetically related to. And that is at odds with our behavior because we're also nice to those that we're not genetically related to.
There's a question here in the chat.
Okay, no, sorry.
Is morality equivalent with or a subset of cooperative behavior?
That's a good question. Yeah. So, well, it's not even. So cooperative behavior is a subset of morality. There's also a bunch of things that humans have value judgments about that are not about cooperative behavior, but humans do have, but many moral judgments are about cooperative behavior. And in other species...
Sorry, that I asked, so I asked actually the question, and the reason was that I think that one can have very immoral cooperative behavior. If you think, for instance, about collective dictatorial systems or something like that, I think this is a form of cooperative behavior which is totally immoral. So I was wondering, this identification is not clear to me, at least.
Yeah. Okay. So here we do simplify things. So we're looking at a subset of everything for humans, where morality is about cooperative behavior and is about good cooperative behavior. So we're looking at instances where they coincide. We try not to be blind to the fact that sometimes one exists without the other and the other without the one, for instance, in other species. And also it's clear that there can be morals that are not beneficial. And actually, one of the things that happens in our explanation is, so I'm going to get back to this issue, is that our mechanism allows for good and evil things to evolve. So the literature is very rosy, is very optimistic about, it's always about explaining nice behavior in humans. It kind of turns a blind eye to the fact that we also have not so nice things. And not so nice things are hard to explain with prisoner's dilemmas, where you can either do nothing or do something good. But actually, our mechanism also allows for the evolution of bad behavior, not group beneficial behavior. But yeah, we can get back to this in more detail for sure later. Okay. I'm sorry, my computer is responding very slowly to me going to the next slide. I don't know why that is, but now let's look at population structure when transmission is cultural. So here, let's just imagine a super stylized population structure, a cycle. Everybody plays a prisoner's dilemma with both of their neighbors. So these defectors here, they play with defecting neighbors on the left and on the right, so they all get a payoff of 0. The defectors on the boundary get a positive 3 from their interaction with their blue neighbor and 0 with from the interaction with their red neighbor. The blue ones on the boundary get -1 from the interaction with their red neighbor. Well, you can figure this out, right? The blue ones in the middle, they get 4. So the cultural transmission models, they have things like randomly individuals are drawn to update their strategy. And if they do, they look to the left, they look to the right. Maybe they look 2 places to the left and 2 places to the right, or some distribution, some locally biased distribution. And when they do, they pick the strategy that gets the highest payoff in their neighborhood, which in this case is the cooperative strategy. And then they switch to cooperative strategies. Now all of those payoff biased imitation rules, they only work if you assume that they don't look at the counterfactual, right? The counterfactual is clearly that if you play defect, you get 3, and if you play corporate, you get 1. 1 is less than 3, you should really defect. So this payoff biased imitation only works if you assume that individuals don't really understand the game, that they're trying to get high payoffs, and when they look around, they assume that if you get high payoffs, it's because you're doing something right. So in this mist of misunderstanding, they do something that actually lowers their payoff. And that's a very poor match with human behavior. So if we put humans in the lab here, it's not that they don't know how the game works and then end up doing something nice to other people, but people consciously, they are fully aware that if they cooperate in a prisoner's dilemma, that they walk out with less money and the other walks out with more money than they have less money. So so this, first of all, is not a match with what people do in the lab, but it's also not a match with if you ask yourself why would this work for humans and not for other species? That's also not a match, because humans are the species on Earth that are the best at understanding games, at understanding incentives, and anticipating other individuals' behaviors. So for all of these, for this whole rich literature of population structure with genetic interpretations, that doesn't match the evidence, because we are nice to genetically unrelated others. And there it goes, being slow again. And if you have a cultural interpretation, that's not a good match with us being really good at understanding incentives and being good at theory of mind. Sorry.
I think there's a question here by Ben.
Yeah, so I mean, just a question on this last point. If the players know the game, that means that, well, it might mean that they also understand that at some point other players will also update the way they are updating, which means that seeing the payoff of 4 on the cooperation side and then thinking the counterfactual, but if I do it, I'll only get 1. But then maybe they know, but in the future, this behavior continues and I will eventually get the 4 because the game repeats, right?
Yes. Yeah, that's a very good point. Yeah, of course, if you assume that people understand the consequence of the game, then there could be forward look. That's what you're saying, right? They could be forward looking. They could reflect on how them switching would affect other people's future switching behavior. Yes. So what I'm doing here is I'm not trying to improve. What I'm doing is I'm trying to say something about the existing literature. So the existing literature, most of it does not do that. So they write a paper and say, here we explain the evolution of cooperation, and then there are models without this forward-lookingness. So models where people have super simple imitation rules. So if that's the model that you propose to explain the evolution of human cooperation, then this argument says that's not a good match with. So your point is well taken that maybe that's not a good model, but that is the model that is out there to explain. It's a category of models. Yeah, good point. Okay, so the behavior itself, if you does not match the prediction very well. So another thing with prisoner's dilemmas is that we are really conditional cooperators, most of us. So we like to cooperate. We like to see mutual cooperation. We hate to cooperate if the other one defects. And that's also not what these models predict. And cross species, it doesn't work very well. Now for repetition, the behavior itself does match the prediction a little bit better. There's a bunch of things you can say about the limits to that as well, but we don't have time for that. There's other stuff that's more important. And also here, the cross-species evidence is not in favor of this explanation, because one of the most important things is there's a whole bunch of other species that also have high repetition rates. they see each other every day. If they want to, they could play tit for tat and become cooperative as well. But reciprocity is almost nowhere to be found outside humans. There's really only a few species. We do it a lot, and there's some species where there's some signs that it could be happening, but those are much more up for debate. And it's not that they don't have the opportunity to use reciprocity. Now, here is our mechanism. Well, it's really not our mechanism, because there's a book from 1988 by Robert Frank, Passions Within Reason. It's a fantastic book, and I have no clue why. Well, I do have some clue why it is that this one hasn't gotten much more traction than it has. But either way, I think this is way more informative about the evolution of human morality than the existing models. And so I just want to explain commitment with a simple example. So the example is the Ultimatum Game, and here I made a super simple version of it. So there's 4 euros, and there's 2 players. The proposer can propose a split, can choose between 4 for the responder and 0 for herself, 1, 2, the whole spectrum. And the responder then has to have an answer ready for all of those 5 proposals. And for all of those, she can accept or reject it. So if she rejects it, all 4 euros disappear and nobody gets anything. If she accepts it, then the proposed split materializes. Now, there's a bunch of Nash Equilibria here. This is one of them. So if the proposer proposes 2 for herself and 2 for the responder, and the responder accepts these 3 proposals, but would reject these 2, then neither of the 2 has a reason to switch to a different strategy. So if the proposer goes to propose more for the responder and less for herself, that would get her less. But if she would propose more for herself, those would get rejected, and then she ends up with 0, and that's also less. So the proposer doesn't want to change. The responder doesn't want to change. For sure, she doesn't want to change this choice here, and those choices don't really matter. Now, you can ask yourself, is this stable? And in order to answer that, you can imagine what would happen if both of them execute their choice with a little bit of noise. So the proposer tries to do this, but sometimes makes this proposal or sometimes this proposal. And that means that the responder sometimes will also have to respond to this proposal. And if you respond with no, then you leave 1 euro on the table. So there will be some selection pressure to switch to yes here. Now, if that happens, if it will take long enough time for that to happen, then we get to a point where the proposer, if there's sufficiently many responders that switch to yes here, then it becomes more advantageous for the proposer to switch to making this proposal. So the Nash equilibrium that we were looking at is not particularly stable. So this Nash equilibrium would be stable. There's no selection pressure against rejecting a proposal in which you get 0 anyway. Now, the idea behind commitment is that suppose that I, but not you, but I switch from yes to no, and you can tell. So the responder would reject this, and the proposer has a way to tell that the responder would reject this. So that's going to be costly for the responder in those cases that the proposer still makes this proposal, or in cases where the proposer doesn't manage to identify this person as a rejector. But if it does work, then there's selection pressure on the proposer to identify these individuals and to make those individuals a better proposal. So Of course, this only works if the proposer knows that he or she is dealing with a responder that will reject this. But if that works, then it's in the best interest of the proposer to differentiate and to give this proposer a better offer. So that means that now we have selection pressure for responders to reject unfavorable offers, for proposers to figure out who are those rejectors. And there's a loss, of course, for responders. They will sometimes leave money on the table, but there's a gain also, and that they on average are going to get better proposals. So we call that's rationally irrational. So it's irrational. It's bad for fitness to leave money on the table, but being committed to leaving money on the table if you don't get a good deal, that is actually good for fitness. So what we do in our paper is we first look at this particular game, then see how good a job the literature is doing at explaining human behavior in this game without commitment, and then we see that with commitment, it's enormously much better. So the literature is a little bit scattered, so there's a lot of labor division within the literature. There's theorists, there's empiricists, and the path between those two is not always clear. But so if we try to make the best of it and give all parts of the literature their place, then you could position, there's the models for the evolution of cooperation. They mainly work with prisoners' dilemmas. We're going to look now first at population structure. The idea is that they may explain the evolution of what is called pro-social preferences, or preferences that lead to behavior where people sometimes give up fitness, either to hurt or to help other individuals. And those pro-social preferences are then assumed that people take them to different games other than the prisoner's dilemma. Now, if the model for the evolution of cooperation is a prisoner's dilemma, then the behavior that leads to, if it's summarized by Hamilton's rule, you can describe those behaviors in the following way. So these lines are isoquants of combinations of my fitness and your fitness that you evaluate as equally nice. So any point right up from this line is a point that you prefer, and a point down left from this line is a point that you do not prefer to the starting point here. So you can graphically represent the preferences that would when what we're playing is prisoner's dilemmas with straight lines. So those are isoquants of combinations of my fitness and your fitness that you find equally good. Now, of course, many games are not played in terms of fitness, but in terms of food or space or something that we're competing over. So if you change, the thing that we're having preferences over, for instance, it can very easily be that your first calories are super helpful in surviving, but after you've eaten a whole bunch of food, then more additional calories don't contribute as much to your probabilities of surviving as the first one did. And in that case, those straight lines in fitness terms could turn into curved lines, convex preferences in terms of something else like food or space. But either way, the most important thing is that the preferences that are used in the literature to explain behavior in games other than the prisoner's dilemma, or also in the prisoner's dilemma, are those that are called inequity averse, and those are not the same as those altruistic preferences that you would get from prisoner's dilemma, from evolution in a model with prisoner's dilemmas. Most notably, in those inequity averse preferences, you are willing to give up fitness if you have more than the other, but you want to benefit the other one. You're willing to give up fitness of your own to give the other one fitness, extra fitness, if you're ahead, but you're willing to give up fitness of your own in order to take fitness from the other if you are behind. And that's not what you would get in a model for the evolution of pro-social preferences with prisoner's dilemmas. So in this path between the models and the empirics, this first arrow is already a problem, because the pro-social preferences that we use aren't the pro-social preference that you would get in a model with prisoner's dilemmas. And the second thing is that, so our ultimatum game would mean that there's proposals on this red line here, and the responder then has to choose between that point on the red line and the origin where nobody gets anything. And so if these preferences explain the behavior, then they would make responders accept proposals that are sufficiently generous and reject proposals that are not generous enough. So that has been used to explain behavior of people in the ultimatum games, but there's been some nice and good experiments where they have different treatments. One where where the proposal is made by a computer, and then why is my computer so slow? And then the rejection rate is much lower than when it's chosen by the proposer. Then the rejection rate is much higher. So that suggests that those preferences are not stable given things. They depend on what the proposer does. And also there's a nice experiment where the chosen proposal, where the alternative is an even more unequal proposal, and if between those, if the proposal that is made is actually the best out of the most generous proposals that the proposer could make, then the rejection rate is much lower than if the same proposal is actually the least generous of the things that the proposer could choose between. Those are rejected much more often. So both of these arrows are not very good. Now maybe we should. I don't know how I don't have a clock here. How am I doing for time?
So maybe another 10 minutes, I think it is.
Is there only 10 minutes left? Oh, gee. Okay. Oh, I should have.
Or maybe 12 minutes.
Oh, okay. Well, that's fine. I should have asked this way before, because I could have made some different choice. So repetition also doesn't work here, because there's well, maybe the short thing here why repetition doesn't work is there's nothing to be gained from doing 50-50 today, 50-50 tomorrow, 50-50 the day after, or 1-0 today, 0-1 tomorrow, 1-0 day. These average out to the same thing, so there's nothing to be gained from fancy equilibria in repetition. Why don't I also jump over some other things that don't really explain this. Maybe it's interesting to look at another game, the trust game. So in the trust game, there's a truster. The truster has let's say 3 euros, can either keep the 3 euros or pass them over to the trustee. If that happens, they turn into 6 euros, and then the trustee can either keep the 6 euros, send 2 back, send 4 back, or send 6 back. And here, the Nash equilibrium is for the trustee selection to never send back anything. And for the truster, knowing that the trustee is never sending back anything, the truster should never send any money over in the first place. Now, human behavior isn't like that. One way to explain human behavior, and in the way that we suggest we should use, is that if you can convince the truster that you are committed to sending back €4, that is bad for your fitness, because that leaves you with €2 and it's less than 6. But it will change the behavior of the truster, because now the truster can get €4 instead of 3 by sending you the money over. So there can be selection for commitment to rationally irrational behavior. It's irrational because you're leaving money on the table, but being committed to it is rational, because that's going to make the truster behave differently in a way that's good for you. So the idea here is that being committed to stuff is going to change what other people do. So it may change the behavior of a partner that you already have. It may also make others choose you as a partner for interaction if they have the freedom to choose. So we don't have too much time, but the thing is that there's many things about human behavior that don't fit, that you wouldn't be able to explain with prisoner's dilemmas, and that are super important parts of human moral behavior. One of the things, for instance, is that we are super focused on altruism or being genuine, right? For us, it's really important that if people do something nice for us, and we know that they're only being strategic or opportunistic about it, we appreciate that way less than if people are nice to us because they really like us and they really care for us. And you can explain that with the evolution of commitment and not with models based on prisoner's dilemmas without commitment. Yeah, so maybe here also could be a bit of a waste to describe the literature on punishment, but also here, well, maybe let's say something about how this relates to experiments in the lab. So if you have prisoner's dilemmas and you have a game after that where you can punish or not punish the other player for their behavior in the first round, then if you commit yourself to punishing the other player if the other player plays defect, you make it in the interest of the other player to cooperate in the first round. Even so, you can have evolution for that, even though punishing is getting you a lower payoff than not punishing. And when we put people in the lab, so in many experiments that have been done in this field, what happens is that there's anonymity throughout the experiment. So you're playing once with your partner and you don't ever meet your partner again. And also it's anonymous in the sense that your future partners don't get any information on your past behavior. So that has led to, so that means that the pathway for the benefits to being committed to punishment are blocked within the lab. So there's no way for other people to find out if you are committed to punishment or not. So that has led to us only considering the option that your punishment is there to improve the person's behavior for the next interaction with someone else. And that's why in the literature it's always called altruistic punishment. But if the real reason is that we are committed to punishment so that we deter our own partners from defecting, then those benefits by design are just excluded to be observed in the lab. And there's a few experiments where people can build a reputation, and what happens then, the behavior we observe then is consistent with what you would expect from a commitment explanation. So yeah, I hope I have some time to also reflect on the cross-species stuff. So here's why commitment is a better match if we compare humans to other species. So we are technological, we use tools, we are social, we do stuff together, and that has shaped a bunch of our mental facilities. So we do delayed gratification, right? If we weren't able to do that, we wouldn't invest in tool making. So our niche as humans is to do stuff together that takes investment. It takes time to mature. We don't just graze every day anew. We do stuff where we have to make investment, and that opens the door for all kinds of opportunistic behavior that those opportunities just don't exist in other species. So our commitment it always serves to not do the opportunistic thing, and if our partners know that we won't do the opportunistic thing, that if we were to do it is going to kill our collective endeavor. Well, this is maybe a too complicated way of trying to say we're just playing different games. We're playing games in which being committed can be to your advantage, and being committed, for instance, in the trust game, facilitates a mutually beneficial exchange. If I commit to sending back money, then you're going to send money to me, and both of us are going to be better off. And those kind of games are just games that other species don't play. So the evolution of commitment should happen and our type of morality should happen in a species that plays these games, and in species that have. So also theory of mind is actually needed for commitment to evolve and for our morality to evolve. If you don't understand what other people may do, if you can't anticipate that one person is going to fall for the temptation to run with the money and someone else doesn't, then of course commitment cannot evolve. But we do have theory of mind. We're the world between the species. We're the world champion in understanding what our conspecifics may or may not do. So it's not a coincidence that we have evolved the morality that we have. So here's an overview of whatever, this is my suggestion of an overview for the different selective pressures. And there's a famous biologist that says nothing about biology makes sense except in light of evolution. And my version for commitment is morality does not make sense except in light of commitment. And we have started to work on commitment in our little group at the university, and these are our group members.
Thank you.
Good.
So do we have any questions? I don't know if you can see questions in the...
So far.
So I was wondering, you were talking about identifying people that are committers in a way, that are committed to certain things. So that sort of requires some sort of communication, I guess.
Yes.
And then in the trust game also there was this level of communication. So there at some point, right, you could even think of like a meta game where you can pretend to commit or not commit and so on, right? In that communication stage beforehand. So
Yeah.
my question is, what role is communication playing in this, and to what extent is communication necessary?
Yeah, so, well, there has to be some form of communication, because otherwise you cannot diversify. So there's a few things to be noted here. So in order for this behavior, for this commitment to be stable, you don't need that all proposers can tell everyone apart perfectly. It's enough to know that they have some degree of they have some accuracy in predicting who is going to reject what offer, and that's enough to keep the equilibrium up there. Now, the communication can come in different forms. So there have been experiments where people, before they play, they can type a promise for different games, and that turns out to work. So how you promise and what you promise and whether you promise is predictive of your future behavior, and proposers respond to it the right way. So they do take the right cues, and those cues are in fact correlated with what they're going to do afterwards. But there's even non-verbal ways in which communication happens. So we did an experiment for the Ultimatum game, where we just made pictures of people, and then what we did is we asked third parties. So we presented people with two pictures, where one of them accepted a certain proposal and the other one rejected, and but they don't know which one, and it's up to them to guess. And apparently, just by looking at a picture, you can do better than chance in saying who is the one that accepted and who is the one that rejected. And we also did a video where they are supposed to play out emotions. So they're, look angry, look happy, look sad. And then if we pick the look angry and we show it, then people can tell, well, not perfectly, but to some better than chance, they can tell who rejected and who accepted. So in the meta game that you're referring to, that's of course the evolutionarily relevant one, right? So in evolution selects for behaviors and for signals. Well, I don't know if that's interesting to say, but yeah, that's of course, what is a question is whether or not it is stable, because there's also selection pressure for fakers, right? If you send the signal that convinces the other one that you're do have a certain behavior, a certain nice behavior, or a certain rejection, that has the possibility to undermine the truthfulness of the signal. Right? If there's sufficiently many fakers, then they take over the population, and then the signal becomes devoid of information. Mm-hmm. So what we do in this paper is not we're not like solving we're not answering the question how did this happen, how did commitment evolve, and how did the truth how do we sustain the truthfulness of the information there. The only thing we're saying is if it has evolved commitment, then this is what you should see in the lab, and it matches what we do see in the lab.
Right.
And the other models that do make predictions that we don't see in the lab, or the behavior in the lab that we do see doesn't match those predictions. And also across species, commitment is a much better match with what makes us different from other species. Yeah.
Any other questions?
Well, maybe I can ask a question. If I understand correctly, in many of the games you presented, the players, they all know and agree about the rewards and punishments that they can get. But it seems to me, at least in real life, that you have some expected reward for cooperating, but that might not correspond to the real reward that you get, because you have to sort of make a leap of faith saying, okay, I can cooperate. And then I think these are my rewards, but you never know for sure, right? So would those kind of effects play an important role, and also in the evolution of behavior, like that we may have different expectations about our rewards while we're playing a game?
So, well, there's two different things, right? So one is I put payoffs there, and they might not be deterministic, right? There may be some probability distribution. So we abstract away from that. We're just saying, this is the expected payoff that you get. So if you and I cooperate, maybe there's some distribution over the benefits to that. Might be 2, it might be 5. There's some probabilities with which it's either of those, and what we put in the payoff matrix is then the expected value of that. And the other thing is that you're saying, well, the world is so much more complex. What the payoffs actually are may have to do with how I think about the game. Yeah.
Or maybe what I'm trying to get at is that there might be heterogeneity in sort of the expected payoffs, so that not all agents agree on the expected payoffs.
Yeah. So you say something that suggests that whether or not we agree can make a difference on what the payoffs actually are, right?
Or what people's strategy might be to cooperate or defect.
Yeah. So in all of those models, what we try to do is to only put the things in there that we have questions about, that we think contribute to the explanation of what we want to explain. So obviously, I don't know, because it's a good point. The world is complex, right? And so one thing is that people can just be wrong about their assessment of the payoffs, right?
Exactly.
So what we assume is that evolution takes care of that. So we assume that people, as best as they can, that the expected value of their assessment of the payoffs, so on average, is correct. So
they have already learned the expected payoffs.
So evolution has taken care of selecting for getting it right more often. Now there might be just physical limits to how much information there is to process. So on average, so people may still be a little bit off, but we're assuming that the average person is spot on with the assessment of the payoffs under the available information. So yeah, so I mean, these things are problems, right? They exist. I mean, yeah, but we're trying to if you would add those, it would make the model more complicated, but I don't think it would add to understanding the mechanism that we're after.
Right, thanks.
Yeah.
Okay, if there are no more questions, then let's thank Matthijs again, and see you next week.
Ooh, sorry, I see that I'm actually 15 minutes over time. Sorry about that.